Good evening. Welcome to Quiet Victorian Nights channel. Tonight, I'd like to invite you to leave the modern world behind for a little while. Imagine that the clocks have slowed, the roads have grown quiet, and somewhere in the gentle countryside of Victorian Yorkshire, an old wooden gate is still waiting to be opened. This is not a story filled with danger or great adventure. Nothing terrible will happen here. No one will need to hurry. Instead, you'll wander through peaceful gardens scented with rosemary and lavender, listen to the distant bells of a small village church, and meet ordinary people whose kindness quietly shaped the lives around them. So before we begin, make yourself as comfortable as you can. Perhaps pull a blanket a little closer. Let your breathing become slow and unhurried. And if, at any point during our journey, you drift peacefully to sleep, then this little cottage has already done exactly what it was meant to do. Yorkshire, the final Thursday of September, 1892, a little after 4 o'clock in the afternoon. The last coaching carriage from Harrogate slowed as it reached the gentle rise overlooking the village of Willow Lane, its wheels rolling more quietly now, across a narrow road bordered by old stone walls, softened with moss and late summer ivy. The horses had travelled since early morning, and even they seemed to understand that villages like this invited slower movements. Nothing in Willow Lane appeared to welcome haste. Emma Ashcroft stepped carefully from the carriage, gathering the hem of her dark travelling dress before her boots touched the uneven stones below. The journey had taken nearly 6 hours, first by train, then by carriage across winding country roads that grew narrower with every passing mile. London already felt impossibly distant. Even York, where she had changed coaches shortly after noon, seemed to belong to another world entirely. The coachman lowered her single leather trunk onto the roadside, with the quiet familiarity of someone who had performed the same task hundreds of times. "There you are, Miss Ashcroft," he said gently, removing his cap. Willow Lane. Emma thanked him with a small smile that carried more tiredness than conversation. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The village stretched quietly below the hill, resting beneath a pale autumn sky washed in soft silver clouds. Thin ribbons of wood smoke drifted lazily from half a dozen chimneys. Beyond the cottages lay open meadows, their grasses already turning from bright summer green toward the muted golds of approaching October. Here and there, ash trees had begun surrendering their first yellow leaves, while ancient oaks still held tightly to the darker colors of late September. It looked almost exactly as she remembered. 8 years had passed since her last visit. 8 harvests, 8 winters, 8 springs that had arrived without her ever seeing the orchard behind her grandmother's cottage bloom again. The coachman adjusted the strap securing her trunk before clearing his throat. "I'm sorry about your grandmother." Emma lowered her eyes. "So am I." Nothing more needed saying. In villages like Willow Lane, people rarely hurried grief. The coachman reached into the pocket of his heavy coat and produced a small envelope sealed with dark green wax. "The solicitor asked me to give you this when we arrived." Emma accepted it. Across the front, written in neat brown ink, were only 3 words. "Miss Emma Ashcroft." She recognized Mr. Hawthorne's handwriting immediately. She slipped the unopened envelope into her coat pocket. There would be time enough to read it once she reached the cottage. The coachman looked toward the narrow lane descending into the village. "I could drive you all the way to the house." Emma followed his gaze. The lane curved gently between old cottages before disappearing beneath arching apple trees farther below. It was hardly more than a footpath now, too narrow for 2 carts to pass comfortably. She shook her head. "I think I'd rather walk." He smiled knowingly. "Your grandmother always said the village should be entered on foot." Emma looked at him. "Did she?" "Oh yes." He chuckled softly. "She claimed people noticed more that way." The horses stamped patiently upon the road. Emma rested one gloved hand upon the handle of her trunk before changing her mind. She removed only her small traveling bag, leaving the larger case for the coachman to deliver later that evening. "I'll collect the trunk afterwards," she said. He nodded. "I'll leave it by the front door." As the carriage disappeared slowly along the road, its wheels gradually fading into the quiet countryside, Emma remained standing alone upon the hillside. Only then did she begin walking. The lane descended gently toward the heart of Willow Lane, winding between low limestone cottages that seemed almost to grow naturally from the earth beneath them. Their walls carried the warm colors of weathered honey, while slate roofs shimmered faintly after the light rain that had passed through earlier that afternoon. Window boxes overflowed with late geraniums, small gardens spilled beyond short stone walls. Bundles of onions hung drying beneath wooden porches. Several cottages displayed strings of lavender suspended beneath their eaves, filling the cool air with a fragrance that drifted gently whenever the breeze wandered through the lane. Nothing announced itself loudly. Everything invited careful attention. Emma walked slowly, not because she was tired, because the village seemed to reward those who noticed small things. A robin balanced upon the handle of an old village pump. Two elderly women paused beside the bakery door, speaking so quietly that their conversation blended with the distant clatter of teacups from inside. Fresh loaves cooled upon wooden shelves behind the bakery window, their warm scent escaping each time the door opened for another customer. Farther along stood the tiny post office, its brass bell ringing softly as a young boy hurried out, carrying two carefully folded newspapers beneath his arm. The church bell struck the quarter hour. 4 slow notes drifted across the rooftops before dissolving into the still afternoon. Emma realized that almost every sound here arrived gently. Even time itself seemed unwilling to interrupt the silence. She continued toward the far end of the village, where the cottages gradually became fewer and the gardens noticeably larger. Somewhere ahead, hidden beyond rows of pear trees and old hawthorn hedges, stood Willow Lane Cottage, the house where she had spent every childhood September, the house she had not seen in 8 years, the house she had returned to because, 2 weeks earlier, her grandmother Eleanor Ashcroft had quietly passed away at the age of 79, leaving no children, no surviving siblings, and only one granddaughter to decide what would become of the little cottage at the edge of the village. Emma had come believing she needed only a few days, meet the solicitor, sort through the house, decide whether to sell, then return to London. At least, that had been the plan. She did not yet know that the cottage waiting beyond the next bend had never truly belonged to one family alone. Nor did she know that one small wooden gate, standing quietly open beneath an old apple tree, had been welcoming strangers for longer than anyone in the village could remember. By the time Emma reached the end of Willow Lane, the afternoon had settled into that gentle hour when the light seemed less interested in brightness than in softness. The lane grew quieter with every step. The last cottage stood behind her now, its small vegetable patch bordered by runner beans climbing weathered hazel poles. Ahead, the village gave way to open countryside, where fields rolled gently toward distant hills, divided by centuries-old stone walls, built without mortar and held together by nothing more than patience, gravity, and time. Willow Lane Cottage appeared gradually rather than suddenly. First came the old apple trees. Their branches leaned over the narrow path as though they had spent decades welcoming visitors before the house itself ever came into view. The fruit hung heavy upon the boughs, colored in shades of green, pale gold, and deep crimson, while several wind-fallen apples rested quietly in the grass below, attracting blackbirds that hopped cautiously between them. Then came the stone wall. It stood only waist-high, softened by moss and tiny ferns that had found homes within the narrow gaps between the limestone blocks. Here and there, small clumps of thyme had rooted themselves naturally, releasing their fragrance whenever the breeze brushed gently across the warm stone. Only after passing the orchard did Emma finally see the cottage. It seemed smaller than memory, or perhaps memories simply had a habit of making places larger than they truly were. The house rested comfortably within its garden, facing the afternoon sun exactly as it had for nearly 70 years. Honey-colored limestone walls glowed softly beneath climbing roses, whose final blossoms nodded lazily in the breeze. Ivy framed 2 upstairs windows without covering them, while the slate roof, darkened by countless Yorkshire winters, carried patches of silver-green lichen that caught the changing light. Nothing about the cottage appeared neglected. Nothing appeared hurried either. It possessed the quiet confidence of a place that had never needed to impress anyone. Emma stopped for several moments before opening the small wooden gate leading from the lane. She did not step inside immediately. Instead, she simply looked. The garden stretched before her like a patchwork stitched together over many decades rather than planned all at once. Gravel paths curved gently instead of running straight. Flower beds seemed to follow the shape of sunlight rather than geometry. Herbs spilled happily beyond the neat edges they had once been given, while old lavender bushes leaned comfortably into one another, unconcerned by perfect symmetry. There were signs everywhere of careful hands, not recent hands, familiar hands. A weathered watering can rested beside the stone well. A pair of worn wooden kneelers sat beneath the pear tree. Twine still hung neatly coiled upon an iron hook outside the small potting shed. Someone who loved order had lived here. Someone who believed that every tool deserved its own place. Emma smiled, almost without noticing. Her grandmother had never searched for anything. She had always known exactly where everything belonged. The air carried the unmistakable fragrance of rosemary, warmed by afternoon sunlight. Mint grew enthusiastically beside the path leading toward the kitchen door. Sage formed tidy grey-green cushions near the low stone wall. Chamomile, now mostly finished for the season, still released its sweet apple scent whenever Emma brushed gently against it. Above the herb beds, bees worked slowly among the last lavender flowers of the year. There were fewer than she remembered, but enough to fill the garden with a quiet humming that blended almost perfectly with the distant rustling of pear leaves overhead. She followed the winding gravel path at an unhurried pace, not toward the front door. Her feet seemed to remember another route entirely, past the herb garden, around the old pear tree, beside the small greenhouse, where condensation still clouded several panes of uneven Victorian glass. The greenhouse looked exactly as it always had. Its painted wooden frame had faded from green to something softer, somewhere between sage and grey. Inside, terracotta pots waited upon long wooden benches. Clay labels still marked rows of seedlings that had long since become mature plants outside. Emma rested her fingertips lightly against the cool glass. She remembered spending rainy afternoons inside with her grandmother, carefully pricking out seedlings into tiny pots while listening to stories about birds, weather, and the curious habits of bees. The memories arrived gently, like old friends who knew better than to interrupt. Beyond the greenhouse stood a small wooden shed, its stable door painted cream many years before. Nearby, bundles of dried lavender hung beneath the eaves, swaying almost imperceptibly whenever the breeze wandered through the garden. Everything smelled faintly of herbs, damp earth, and apples. It was a fragrance no city could ever imitate. Emma continued walking. Only then did she notice something curious. Every door she could see was closed. The greenhouse, the potting shed, the woodshed, even the cottage itself, each one carefully shut, each one protected. Yet at the far end of the garden, beneath the oldest apple tree, another gate stood quietly open, not wide, only just enough for one person to pass through. It opened toward the meadow beyond. No chain, no latch, no lock. The gate moved gently with the breeze, swinging only an inch or two before settling again into silence. Emma frowned. She could not remember ever seeing it closed. At the time, she had been too young to wonder why. Now, standing alone in the garden after 8 long years away, the question returned with unexpected clarity. Why would her grandmother carefully lock every building, yet leave the garden open to the world? The afternoon was already beginning to fade, and the September air carried that familiar promise of an early Yorkshire evening. She reached into the pocket of her traveling coat and unfolded the small envelope the coachman had handed to her upon arriving in the village. Inside lay a single brass key. It was heavier than modern keys, beautifully made, its handle worn smooth by decades of careful use. Tiny scratches caught the soft afternoon light, suggesting it had passed through many patient hands before finally resting in hers. Emma turned it over once in her palm. She remembered watching her grandmother unlock this very door countless times, always with the same unhurried movement, always pausing for a moment before stepping inside, as though greeting the house itself. She smiled faintly. Only now did she realize she had unconsciously done exactly the same. The front door opened with surprising ease. The hinges offered only the gentlest whisper, followed by the familiar scent of beeswax polish, dried lavender, old oak, and something else she had not encountered for many years. The quiet fragrance of a house that had been lived in slowly, not decorated, not arranged, simply lived in. Emma stepped across the threshold. Behind her, the afternoon remained warm. Inside, the cottage held the cool stillness of thick limestone walls that had protected generations from Yorkshire winters and summer heat alike. She closed the door gently. The silence was different indoors. Outside, silence belonged to birds, wind, and distant fields. Inside, it belonged to clocks. The old grandfather clock in the hallway continued its patient rhythm exactly as it always had. Tick, pause, tick, pause. Its slow heartbeat filled the cottage without ever disturbing it. Nothing appeared abandoned. Nothing suggested loss. It looked instead as though Eleanor Ashcroft had simply stepped into the garden and might return at any moment, carrying a basket of herbs beneath one arm. Emma removed her gloves and placed them carefully upon the small oak hall table. Beside them rested a porcelain bowl containing several polished chestnuts collected earlier that month. A walking stick leaned neatly beside the staircase. 2 gardening hats still hung from the row of wooden pegs beneath the stairs. Even the umbrella stand contained her grandmother's favorite ashwood walking cane. Everything waited exactly where it belonged. The sitting room lay beyond a pair of half-open doors. Late afternoon sunlight entered through lace curtains, falling gently across worn oak floorboards polished by countless footsteps over many decades. A fire had not been lit since the funeral, yet the room still carried the faint scent of seasoned firewood stacked neatly beside the hearth. Emma walked slowly, not because she feared disturbing the silence, because the cottage seemed to reward slow movements in much the same way the village had. Books filled every shelf, not arranged by color, nor by size, but by use. Gardening books rested nearest the window where daylight was strongest. Poetry occupied the small shelf beside Eleanor's favorite armchair. Several well-thumbed volumes of natural history lay open upon a writing desk, tiny scraps of pressed fern marking unfinished pages. Emma recognized nearly every title. Many had been read aloud to her on rainy afternoons when gardening was impossible. The room itself had changed very little. Only time had altered the colors. The green wallpaper had softened into muted olive. The Persian rug had faded gently where sunlight reached it each afternoon. The mahogany furniture had become smoother beneath decades of careful polishing. Age had not diminished the cottage. It had only made everything quieter. She wandered next into the kitchen. Copper pans reflected warm patches of evening light. Blue and white china stood neatly arranged behind glass-fronted cupboards. Bundles of dried sage, mint, lavender, and chamomile still hung from the ceiling beams, filling the room with the gentle fragrance that had greeted visitors for as long as Emma could remember. Upon the broad wooden table stood a single stoneware jug. Inside rested several stems of dried hydrangea, their colors faded almost to parchment, fresh enough to suggest they had been placed there only weeks before, old enough to remind Emma that no fresh flowers would ever again be gathered by her grandmother's hands. She rested her fingertips lightly upon the worn edge of the table. How many loaves of bread had been kneaded here? How many jars of blackberry jam filled? How many neighbors had sat by the window with a cup of tea while rain tapped softly against the glass? Some houses remembered conversations. This one seemed to remember kindness. The evening light had begun to turn golden by the time Emma climbed the narrow staircase. Upstairs were 2 bedrooms, a linen cupboard, and the small room where she herself had slept during every childhood visit. Nothing had changed. The quilt remained neatly folded across the bed. A small vase of dried lavender still rested upon the windowsill. Even the illustrated book of British wildflowers she had loved at the age of 10 remained upon the bedside table, its faded ribbon marking the very page she had last read. Emma laughed quietly. Grandmother. It was the first word she had spoken inside the cottage. The sound disappeared almost immediately into the gentle silence. As dusk slowly gathered outside, she returned downstairs and stood for a moment beside the kitchen window. Beyond the glass, the garden had become softer beneath the evening light. The open gate still stood beneath the old apple tree, unchanged, patient, waiting. Emma drew the curtains, lit the small oil lamp upon the kitchen table, and decided that whatever answers the cottage still held, they could wait until morning. Outside, somewhere beyond the open gate, a blackbird sang one final evening song before settling for the night. Emma woke before the church bell announced 7 o'clock. For a few quiet moments, she remained perfectly still beneath the familiar quilt, listening to the cottage slowly awaken around her. The old grandfather clock downstairs continued its patient rhythm. A faint breeze brushed gently against the climbing roses outside. Somewhere in the orchard, a robin had already begun the first song of the morning, answered almost immediately by another farther across the meadow. The silence no longer felt unfamiliar. It felt inhabited, not by voices, but by ordinary life, the kind of life that began long before anyone opened a door. Soft September light filtered through the lace curtains, carrying with it the pale golden color that belonged only to English autumn mornings. Unlike the bright sunshine of summer, this light arrived quietly, touching windowsills, floorboards, and old furniture with equal gentleness, asking nothing except to be noticed. Emma rose slowly and crossed the room. When she drew back the curtains, Willow Lane Cottage revealed an entirely different garden from the one she had explored the previous afternoon. Morning had transformed everything. Tiny drops of dew rested upon every lavender stem. Spider webs stretched between rosemary bushes, like delicate lace stitched overnight by invisible hands. The orchard shimmered beneath a thin veil of mist that lingered close to the grass before gradually lifting into the warming air. Beyond the open gate, the meadow seemed almost silver beneath the early sunlight. Nothing moved, or so it appeared. She dressed simply, fastening the small pearl buttons of her traveling blouse before making her way downstairs. The kitchen felt cooler than the bedrooms. The stone floor still carried the night's chill, while the broad wooden table waited quietly beneath the morning light. Emma opened the pantry. Everything remained astonishingly well organized. Jars of blackberry preserves stood beside neatly labeled marmalade. Tea tins occupied the highest shelf. Fresh bread, wrapped carefully in linen, rested inside the old bread cupboard. Her grandmother had prepared this house as though she expected visitors every single day. Emma smiled. Some habits, it seemed, continued even after death. She filled the black kettle from the kitchen pump and placed it upon the cast-iron range. Soon the familiar sound of gently warming water filled the room. There were few sounds more comforting than a kettle preparing morning tea. As she waited, Emma wandered toward the kitchen window. Outside, the herb garden glistened beneath the rising sun. Bees had not yet begun their day's work. Only butterflies drifted lazily between the lavender and late-blooming asters. The open gate remained exactly where she had left it the evening before, half open, facing the meadow. For several moments she watched without thinking. Then, movement. Someone had entered the garden, not through the cottage, not from the lane, but through the open gate beyond the orchard. Emma instinctively stepped closer to the window. The visitor was a little boy, perhaps no older than 8. He wore heavy woolen stockings that had slipped untidily around his ankles and carried a small wicker basket, almost too large for him to manage comfortably. He did not hesitate. He did not look toward the cottage. Instead, he walked with complete confidence along the narrow gravel path, as though he had traveled it many times before. He stopped beside the large clump of peppermint growing near the kitchen wall. Very carefully, he picked only 3 healthy stems. No more, no less. He examined them with surprising seriousness before placing them gently inside his basket. Then he paused, straightened one bent plant with both hands, brushed a little soil back around its roots, and quietly continued toward the gate. Emma frowned. The boy had not behaved like someone stealing. Quite the opposite. He had behaved as though he had been invited. She reached instinctively for the front door. By the time she stepped outside into the crisp September air, the little visitor had already disappeared beyond the meadow. Only the peppermint leaves moved softly in the morning breeze, releasing their cool fragrance into the garden. Emma walked to the herb bed and knelt beside the plant. 3 stems were missing. Only 3, taken so carefully that it was difficult to see where they had been cut. She touched the remaining leaves. Someone had taught that child exactly how to harvest herbs without harming the plant. Someone who knew this garden very well. Emma looked slowly toward the open gate once again. Emma remained in the garden for several minutes after the little boy had disappeared across the meadow. The morning seemed to close quietly behind him. Nothing hurried. The peppermint leaves settled once again beneath the gentle breeze, while a single honeybee landed upon the nearby lavender as though nothing unusual had happened at all. Emma looked once more toward the open gate. It stood exactly as before, neither inviting nor forbidding, simply open. She brushed a little soil from her fingertips and slowly returned to the kitchen. The kettle had begun to sing softly upon the range. Soon the familiar fragrance of freshly brewed tea drifted through the cottage, mixing with beeswax, dried herbs, and warm bread until the entire room seemed filled with memories she had almost forgotten. She carried her breakfast to the small table beside the eastern window. It had always been her grandmother's favorite place in the morning. From there, one could see nearly the entire herb garden without ever leaving the house. Emma wondered whether Eleanor had also watched the garden while drinking tea each morning. Perhaps she had counted the bees, or noticed the first robin of autumn, or simply enjoyed watching sunlight move slowly across the gravel paths. The thought made Emma smile. Some habits belonged less to people than to places. She had barely finished pouring a second cup of tea when movement caught her eye once again. Another visitor. This time, it was an elderly woman. She entered through the very same gate with the quiet confidence of someone who had followed the same path hundreds of times before. She wore a dark woolen shawl, despite the mild September morning, and carried a small linen basket folded neatly beneath one arm. Emma watched carefully. The woman did not hesitate. She walked directly toward the rosemary bushes growing beside the stone wall. For a long moment, she simply stood there, not picking, only looking, almost as though greeting an old friend. Then she reached out and clipped 2 small sprigs, only 2. She thanked the plant in a voice too soft for Emma to hear clearly. After placing the rosemary into her basket, she gently brushed away a few yellow leaves that had fallen among the stems. She noticed a broken twig nearby. Without being asked, she tucked it neatly beneath the surrounding branches, where it would no longer be seen. Only then did she turn to leave. Emma hesitated. Surely this could not be another coincidence. She stepped outside before the woman reached the gate. "Excuse me." The elderly lady stopped at once. She turned with a warm expression that suggested neither surprise nor embarrassment. Instead, she smiled, as though she had been expecting this meeting for quite some time. "You must be Miss Ashcroft." Emma nodded. "I am." The woman looked toward the cottage for a brief moment, before returning her gentle gaze. "You have your grandmother's eyes." There was such simple certainty in the remark that Emma found herself smiling despite her confusion. "I'm sorry," she said politely. "I don't believe we've met." "Oh no." The woman laughed softly. "I'm Martha Bell. Everyone simply calls me Mrs. Bell." Emma recognized the name immediately. Her grandmother had mentioned Mrs. Bell many times in letters over the years. She remembered reading about blackberry pies delivered every Christmas, about knitting circles during long winter evenings, about someone who always knew when the swallows returned. It had never occurred to Emma that one day she would meet her. Mrs. Bell glanced down at the rosemary resting inside her basket. "I hope you don't mind." Emma looked from the basket to the herb bed. "I was actually wondering." She paused, uncertain how to ask without sounding impolite. Mrs. Bell seemed to understand before the question was spoken. "About the garden?" Emma nodded. "I've now seen 2 people come through the gate this morning. They both took herbs." Mrs. Bell smiled again. "Yes, and—" Emma hesitated. "They behaved as though they had permission." Mrs. Bell's expression softened. "They do." Emma waited. Surely an explanation would follow. Instead, Mrs. Bell looked toward the open gate where the meadow shimmered beneath the brightening September sun. After a thoughtful silence, she simply said, "Your grandmother never believed a garden should feed only one table. Nothing more. No explanation. No story. Only that single sentence." Before Emma could ask another question, Mrs. Bell wished her a pleasant morning and continued quietly toward the meadow, disappearing beyond the open gate exactly as the little boy had done before her. Emma remained standing beside the rosemary bushes. The words lingered in her thoughts. A garden should never feed only one table. She looked slowly across the herb beds once more. The peppermint, the sage, the thyme, the rosemary. For the first time, she noticed that each plant had been allowed to grow far larger than one household could ever possibly need. The day had passed quietly after Mrs. Bell's visit. Emma had washed her breakfast cup, folded the linen cloth beside the sink, and spent the remainder of the morning moving slowly through the kitchen cupboards, not with the brisk purpose of someone sorting another person's belongings, but with the cautious attention of someone trying to understand a life from the objects it had left behind. The cottage was full of small records, not formal ones, not diaries tied with ribbon or letters preserved for sentiment, but the quieter kind. A row of jam jars labeled in her grandmother's narrow hand, a bundle of seed packets kept inside an old biscuit tin, a small note tucked into the flour bin, reminding no one in particular that strong white flour was better for Friday bread. A list of names pinned inside the pantry door: Mrs. Bell, Blackberry, School, Chamomile, Thomas, Thyme, Baker, Rosemary. Emma stood before that list for some time. It was written on thick cream paper, faintly yellowed at the corners, with no date and no explanation, only names and plants, nothing more. She touched the edge of the paper with one finger. The house remained silent around her. Outside, the afternoon sun had moved westward, and the garden, seen through the kitchen window, had softened into shades of green, gold, and late lavender. The rosemary hedge stirred in the breeze. The open gate at the end of the orchard remained exactly where it had been since she arrived, half open, unconcerned, patient. Emma turned from the pantry and noticed the low drawer beneath the kitchen dresser. It was the drawer her grandmother had always called the useful drawer. As a child, Emma had thought this an odd name because it contained very little that seemed useful to her then: string, brown paper, old pencils, spare labels, buttons, a measuring tape, small pieces of candle, saved for lighting fires. Now, opening it slowly, she understood. The drawer was full of the kind of usefulness that only becomes visible when one is responsible for a house. At the very back, beneath a folded linen seed cloth and a packet of brass plant markers, lay a book. It was larger than a notebook, but smaller than a ledger, bound in faded green cloth. The corners were softened from years of use, and the spine had grown pale where many hands had lifted it from the drawer. On the cover, written in black ink that had browned with age, were 3 words: The Garden Book. Emma carried it to the kitchen table. She did not open it at once. For reasons she could not immediately explain, the book felt less like something she had found and more like something she had been allowed to find. She made tea first. The ordinary act steadied her. The kettle warmed upon the range. The cup waited. The tea leaves darkened the water slowly, releasing their familiar fragrance into the room. Outside, a robin landed on the stone edge of the well and remained there for several seconds, bright-eyed and self-important, before disappearing into the lavender. Only then did Emma sit. She opened the book. The first page was not a diary. There was no confession, no story, no explanation of why the gate had never been locked. There was only a date: March 3rd, 1871. Cold morning. Light frost. Planted mint by kitchen wall. Alice. Emma read the line twice, then the next. March 10th. Rain all day. Rosemary cut back. Mrs. Bell. March 24th. Chamomile sown near south wall. School. April 2nd. Time divided. Thomas. April 9th. Lavender moved near a path. For those who cannot sleep. Emma sat very still. The pages were filled in the same manner. Weather, plant, name. Weather, plant, name. There were no long reflections, no private complaints, no personal sorrow. Her grandmother had not written in the book the way a person wrote for themselves. She had written as someone keeping track of promises. Emma turned the pages slowly. May 1880. Borage doing well. Leave for bees. June 1881. Sage too large. Cut after Mrs. Bell comes. September 1883. Apples early. Leave lower branches for children. October 1885. mint strong. Alice's boy knows where to find it. February 1888. Snow. Time under glass. Shepherds coughing again. The handwriting changed very little across the years. It had the same careful pressure, the same precise spacing, the same habit of leaving room in the margins, as though the page itself might one day require air and silence. Emma leaned closer. Some entries were marked with small symbols, a tiny circle beside certain names, a line beneath certain plants, a star next to one sentence written in early spring. "Do not cut the rosemary before Sunday." She smiled faintly. The sentence sounded exactly like her grandmother, gentle, firm, entirely sure of itself. She turned another page. There were entries from the years Emma remembered visiting. July 1887. Emma helped water lavender, spilled half the can, very pleased with herself. Emma laughed softly. The sound surprised her. It moved through the kitchen and vanished into the warm quiet, leaving behind something lighter than grief. She read on. August 1887. Emma likes the apple mint best. September 1888. Pressed flowers with Emma. She chose foxglove, though told not to touch. Must watch her. September 1889. Emma asked why bees prefer lavender. Good question. The book blurred a little. Emma looked away toward the window until her eyes cleared. She had thought the garden book would tell her about plants. Instead, it was beginning to tell her about attention. Her grandmother had noticed everything, not loudly, not sentimentally, but with an exactness so steady it had become a form of love. Emma turned to later pages. The names appeared again and again. Alice, Mrs. Bell, School, Thomas, Sarah, Reverend Cole, Dr. Merriweather. The same plants returned too, each one tied to certain people, as naturally as if roots had grown between them. Mint for Alice, rosemary for Mrs. Bell, chamomile for the school, thyme for Thomas, lavender for sleeplessness, calendula for bruises, comfrey for sprains, apples for children, borage for bees. No page said why, no page explained the gate, but the meaning began to gather quietly. Her grandmother had not planted the garden as one plants a private pleasure. She had planted it like a person setting a table, enough for herself, enough for guests, enough for those who might come without asking. Emma sat at the kitchen table until the tea in her cup had gone cold. Outside, the open gate shifted slightly in the afternoon breeze. For the first time, she did not think of it as careless. She thought of it as deliberate, a door left open because someone, somewhere, might need what grew inside. The following morning began much like the one before. Mist rested low across the meadow beyond the orchard, softening the stone walls until they appeared almost to dissolve into the pale September light. Tiny drops of dew gathered upon every lavender stem, and the rosemary, still cool from the night air, released its fragrance only when the first sunlight reached its leaves. Emma had left the garden book open upon the kitchen table. She glanced at it while pouring her morning tea, not to search for answers, only to decide where to begin. The entry for that day, written many years earlier, was wonderfully ordinary. September 28th. Cut lavender after breakfast. Collect seed heads before the wind. Tie climbing roses. Nothing more. No explanation. No reason. Emma smiled. Perhaps gardens, like people, revealed themselves through small routines rather than grand occasions. She carried a pair of old pruning shears into the garden. They fit comfortably in her hand despite their age. The wooden handles had been polished smooth by decades of careful use. Probably by Eleanor. Probably thousands of mornings just like this one. Emma began with the lavender. Her grandmother had always cut it slowly, never taking too much from one plant. She remembered that now. One handful from here, another from farther down the path, always leaving enough blossoms for the late bees, that still wandered through the garden at the end of September. She paused often, not because the work was difficult, because every few moments another bee arrived, burying itself happily among the purple flowers. She found herself waiting for them to finish before reaching for her shears. It seemed the polite thing to do. When the lavender had been gathered into small bundles, Emma carried them beneath the porch roof, where old lengths of linen string still hung upon a wooden peg. She tied each bundle exactly as she remembered Eleanor doing. Not tightly, just enough for the stems to dry together. The fragrance filled the cool morning air. It smelled exactly like the linen cupboard upstairs, exactly like winter evenings, exactly like home. Later she wandered to the rose arch beside the front path. Several long stems had grown untidily during the summer. She found soft strips of faded cloth folded neatly inside a small tin beneath the potting bench. Not wire, not twine, cloth, gentle enough not to bruise the stems. Emma smiled again. Even in something as simple as tying roses, Eleanor had preferred kindness over speed. By mid-morning, the sun had climbed above the orchard. Goldfinches fluttered through the apple trees, knocking ripe fruit softly onto the grass below. Emma collected seed heads from calendula, foxgloves and hollyhocks, placing each variety into separate paper envelopes, exactly as the garden book instructed. As she worked, she noticed something she had overlooked before. The packets already waiting upon the shelves inside the potting shed were not labeled by color, nor by flower. They were labeled by season: spring, summer, autumn, and one small box simply read, "For next year, not for me." She stood quietly, holding the little wooden box. The words were almost impossibly simple, yet they seemed to describe Eleanor better than any diary ever could. Everything she planted had been meant for a season she might never see. Everything she saved had been prepared for hands that might not yet have arrived. Emma carried the seed box back to the shelf. The morning's work continued. She weeded carefully between the thyme, swept fallen pear leaves from the gravel path, filled the old watering cans from the stone well. Then, just after sunrise had given way to the softer light of late morning, she began watering the herb beds. One can, then another. The water darkened the dry earth, releasing the rich scent of soil that had been warmed by generations of summers and cooled by generations of autumn rain. She realized something then. For nearly 3 hours, she had worked without once thinking about whether she would sell the cottage. The thought simply had not appeared. Instead, she had wondered whether the lavender should be cut tomorrow as well, whether the roses needed another tie before October winds arrived, whether the calendula would flower once more before the first frost. The garden had quietly rearranged her thoughts, not by asking her to stay, only by giving her something worth returning to tomorrow morning. Emma leaned upon the handle of the watering can and looked slowly across the herb beds. For the first time since arriving in Willow Lane, she no longer felt like a visitor. She felt like an apprentice, not learning how to grow plants, learning how Eleanor had cared for people, one quiet morning at a time. Every village deserves the smell of fresh bread on a Sunday. For years, Sarah continued, those rosemary bushes kept our bakery supplied. Every loaf we baked after church, every savory pie, every roast shared by a family who perhaps couldn't grow herbs of their own. Emma remained silent. The breeze moved softly through the hedge between them. Sarah glanced toward the cottage windows. Your grandmother never asked us to thank her. In fact, she preferred we didn't. Emma looked at her curiously. Why? Because she believed gratitude could sometimes become another kind of debt. Sarah picked up her basket. She would say, if someone needs rosemary, let them take rosemary. If they need bread, give them bread. No one should feel they owe kindness back. For a long moment, neither woman spoke. The bees continued their slow work among the lavender. Somewhere beyond the orchard, A horse pulled a cart along the village road, its harness bells ringing softly in the distance. Sarah adjusted the linen cloth covering her basket. "Before I go," she reached inside and lifted out a small round loaf. Its crust was still warm. Steam escaped faintly where it had cracked during baking. "I've brought this." Emma instinctively reached for her purse. Sarah gently shook her head. "No, Eleanor never paid, and she never allowed me to." She placed the loaf upon the stone table beneath the pear tree, exactly, Emma suspected, where countless loaves had rested over the years. "Some exchanges," Sarah said with a smile. "Don't need coins." She wished Emma a pleasant morning and disappeared once more through the open gate. Emma watched until the baker had become only a small figure walking between the hedgerows toward the village. Then she looked down at the loaf of bread. Beside it lay 3 tiny rosemary leaves that had fallen unnoticed from Sarah's basket. Emma picked one up and breathed in its clean, resinous fragrance. She finally understood that the rosemary hedge had never existed simply to flavor bread. It had quietly connected the cottage kitchen to every Sunday table in Willow Lane, and perhaps that was how Eleanor had always gardened, not from one flower bed to another, but from one neighbor to the next. By the beginning of October, the mornings had become noticeably cooler. A fine silver mist settled across the meadow before sunrise, lingering among the apple trees until the first rays of light slowly persuaded it to lift toward the hills beyond Willow Lane. The bees no longer hurried from flower to flower. Instead, they moved with the quiet determination of creatures who understood that the warm days of autumn were becoming fewer. Emma had begun to understand that gardens changed their pace with the seasons. Spring invited planting. Summer asked for patience. Autumn became a season of gathering, not only seeds, but memories. Each morning she carried the garden book into the kitchen after breakfast. She no longer searched it for mysteries. Instead, she opened it to whatever page seemed to find her. Some entries were only a single line. October 2nd, chamomile nearly finished. School on Friday. Nothing more. No explanation. No description. Only those 3 words. School on Friday. Emma wondered what they meant. The answer arrived sooner than she expected. Late that same morning, while she was hanging bundles of lavender beneath the porch, she noticed a woman entering through the open gate. She walked with an easy, measured pace, carrying a leather satchel over one shoulder and a straw hat in her hand. Several books peeked from the satchel's opening. She paused beside the chamomile bed, smiling, before she bent to gather a few delicate blossoms that still remained among the fading stems. Only a handful. She chose the flowers carefully, leaving the freshest blooms untouched. Emma recognized her almost immediately. "You must be the schoolteacher." The woman looked up with warm, thoughtful eyes. "And you must be Miss Ashcroft." She smiled. "My name is Margaret Ellis. I've been hoping we'd meet." Emma walked across the path. "I saw your name in my grandmother's garden book." Miss Ellis laughed softly. "I rather imagined you might." She held up the small bundle of chamomile. "I still come every autumn." "For the children?" Emma asked. "For the children." Miss Ellis looked around the garden, breathing deeply. "It still smells exactly the same." Emma glanced toward the chamomile bed. "I never knew grandmother grew flowers for the school." "Oh," Margaret smiled. "Not simply flowers." She looked toward the old apple tree, where sunlight filtered gently through branches now touched with gold. Every May, when the first chamomile opened, Eleanor would send word that the garden was ready. "Ready for what?" Emma asked. "For a lesson." Emma looked puzzled. "A lesson? The best classroom in the village." Margaret nodded toward the winding paths. "Right here." She walked slowly between the flower beds, and Emma followed. The children arrived, carrying little notebooks. No desks, no blackboards, no examinations, only curiosity. They stopped beside the chamomile patch. Eleanor would kneel here with them. She never began by telling them the names of flowers. She asked them to notice the smell, the shape of the leaves, which bees preferred which blossoms, how the wind bent the stems. Emma smiled. It sounded exactly like Eleanor. Afterward, Margaret continued, each child picked just one flower, never more. They pressed it between the pages of an old book, and beside it they wrote. She paused, remembering, not the flower's name, but where they had found it. Emma tilted her head slightly. Why? Eleanor believed that places are remembered longer than facts. The children would forget the Latin names. They might forget the season, but they would always remember. Margaret looked across the garden. The morning they stood beneath this apple tree. They reached the narrow path leading toward the orchard. There was another rule, the teacher said. Emma waited. No flower could ever be picked unless another one was left behind. Emma looked down at the remaining chamomile blossoms. Suddenly, the careful way everyone harvested the garden made perfect sense. Nobody hurried. Nobody took handfuls. Nobody stripped a plant bare. Each visitor left enough for tomorrow, enough for the bees, enough for someone else. Margaret gently tucked the little bouquet into her satchel. The children still press flowers every spring. They use different books now. They've grown taller. Some have children of their own. But every year, she smiled toward the open gate, someone still asks whether Miss Ashcroft's garden is ready. Emma looked beyond the orchard, where the gate stood quietly open beneath the old apple tree. For the first time, she imagined dozens of children crossing that threshold over the years, some carrying notebooks, some chasing butterflies, some asking impossible questions about bees and seeds and seasons. The garden had never been only a place where things were grown. It had been a place where children learned how to notice the world. As Miss Ellis prepared to leave, she turned back for one last thought. Eleanor always told them the same thing before they went home. Emma waited. Margaret smiled. A flower is easy to grow. Attention is much harder. Then she stepped through the open gate and continued along the meadow path toward the village school. Emma remained beside the fading chamomile long after the teacher had disappeared from sight. She knelt quietly and touched one small white blossom that had escaped the first autumn frost. The garden book had listed only a single word, school. Now she understood that it had never meant a building. It had meant every curious child who had once crossed the open gate, learned to kneel beside a flower, and gone home seeing the world just a little more carefully than before. Several days later, the weather changed. The bright September mornings gave way to quieter October skies, where pale clouds drifted slowly above the Yorkshire hills, and the air carried the unmistakable scent of damp earth. During the night, a gentle rain had fallen across Willow Lane, leaving every leaf washed clean and every gravel path darkened with moisture. Emma stepped into the garden just after sunrise. The rain had done what rain always seemed to do in her grandmother's garden. Nothing looked untidy. Everything simply looked refreshed. The lavender bowed beneath tiny drops of water. Spiderwebs stretched between rosemary branches like delicate silver lace. The thyme growing beside the old stone path released its fragrance each time Emma brushed gently past it. She paused there for a moment. The garden book rested beneath her arm. That morning's entry was as brief as ever. October 8th. Rain overnight. Leave time by the gate. Thomas. She read the last word again. Thomas. She had seen the name many times before, always beside time, never explained. As she closed the book, she heard the familiar creak of the wooden gate. Someone was coming. An elderly man entered the garden with the slow, steady gait of someone who had spent an entire lifetime walking across open fields. His heavy boots were marked with dried clay, and his weathered wool coat carried a faint scent of sheep's wool and wood smoke. In one hand, he held a shepherd's crook, polished smooth by decades of use. In the other, a flat cap that he removed politely as soon as he saw Emma. "Good morning, Miss Ashcroft." His voice was gentle, quiet, the kind of voice that belonged naturally to wide hills and patient animals. Emma smiled. "Good morning. You must be Thomas." He nodded. "I suppose the garden book gave me away." Emma laughed softly. "It did." Thomas glanced toward the time bed beside the gate. "I've come for a little time, if that's still all right." Emma looked surprised by the question. "I think grandmother would expect you to." The old shepherd smiled, though he did not answer immediately. Instead, he walked toward the thyme and crouched carefully, despite the stiffness that age had brought to his knees. He clipped only a few small sprigs, not enough to leave a gap, barely enough to fill the palm of his hand. Emma watched him. "You always take so little." Thomas looked up. "Because someone else may come after me." He wrapped the thyme inside a clean handkerchief before placing it into his coat pocket. "For tea?" Emma asked. "For tea, and soup, and sometimes simply to keep beside the fire." He looked across the meadow, where a small flock of sheep grazed quietly beneath the grey morning sky. "When you spend every day out on these hills, the wind eventually finds your chest." Emma nodded. "My grandmother knew that." Thomas smiled. "She knew everyone's winter before winter arrived." Emma said nothing. She sensed there was more. "There was one particularly cold year," Thomas continued. "I believe it was the winter of '81. The snow stayed for nearly 3 weeks. The lanes disappeared. The sheep hardly left the lower fields." He paused, remembering. "I caught a dreadful cough, so bad I couldn't climb the western pasture." Emma listened quietly. "I came here to apologize. I hadn't helped Eleanor repair the orchard fence before the snow. I thought she'd be disappointed." Thomas chuckled softly. "Instead, she opened the gate before I even reached it." "You're coughing," she said. "Go and cut yourself some time. The kettle is already on." He smiled at the memory. "I told her I hadn't asked." Thomas looked down at the thyme in his hand. She simply answered. He spoke the words slowly, exactly as he had heard them more than 10 years before. "Take the time. Leave the gate open. Someone else may need it before evening." For a long while, neither of them spoke. Only the soft sound of sheep calling across the meadow drifted toward the garden. Emma found herself looking instinctively toward the gate, still open, always open. Thomas adjusted his coat before preparing to leave. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "I've walked through that gate for nearly 20 years. Never once did Eleanor ask why I came. She assumed that if someone entered a garden before breakfast," he smiled, "they probably needed something more than conversation." Emma laughed quietly. The old shepherd placed his cap back upon his head. "I still make thyme tea every winter. My grandchildren insist it tastes dreadful." He smiled with unmistakable affection. "But they drink it anyway, because I tell them Eleanor would have expected them to." He tipped his cap politely and walked back toward the meadow. Emma remained beside the thyme long after he had gone. The rain-washed leaves glistened softly in the pale autumn light. She reached down and brushed her fingers gently across them. The fragrance rose immediately into the cool morning air, warm, earthy, comforting. The garden book had paired only 2 words: time, Thomas. Now Emma understood that the space between those 2 names had once held countless winter mornings, steaming cups of tea, quiet kindness, and a gate that had remained open so that no one would ever have to ask before receiving what they needed. Part 10. The Doctor. A week later, autumn had settled fully over Willow Lane. The first leaves had begun to gather along the stone walls, where every passing breeze arranged them into quiet corners before another wind came to move them elsewhere. The mornings were cooler now, and Emma had grown accustomed to beginning each day with a shawl draped lightly around her shoulders as she crossed the dew-covered garden. The rhythm of the cottage had become familiar. The kettle first, the shutters next, then a slow walk through the herb beds before breakfast. Some mornings there were visitors. Some mornings there were only birds. Emma had learned to enjoy both. That Thursday, she found herself working near the southern border, where bright orange calendula still bloomed despite the shortening days. Beside them grew sturdy clumps of comfrey, their broad leaves already beginning to fade with the season. She remembered seeing both names many times in the garden book, always together: calendula, comfrey, doctor, never anything more. She was gently removing a few faded flower heads when she heard footsteps on the gravel path. They were slower than Sarah's, lighter than Thomas's, measured, almost thoughtful. An elderly gentleman entered through the open gate, carrying a leather doctor's bag that had clearly travelled many country lanes over the years. His grey beard was neatly trimmed, and his dark coat carried the faint scent of rain, polished leather, and dried herbs. He paused beside the gate, removed his hat, and looked quietly around the garden. For several moments, he did not move at all. It was almost as though he had come to greet an old friend. Emma approached with a welcoming smile. "Good morning." He inclined his head politely. "You must be Miss Ashcroft." "And you must be Dr. Merriweather." He smiled. "I see Eleanor has introduced us already." Emma lifted the garden book she had been carrying beneath one arm, in her own way. The doctor chuckled softly. That sounds exactly like her. He did not walk immediately toward the calendula. Instead, he wandered slowly through the paths, pausing here and there to observe the late flowers. He admired the roses, bent briefly to examine the thyme, touched the bark of the old apple tree. Emma noticed something curious. Unlike every other visitor, he did not gather a single stem. Finally she asked, "You aren't taking anything today?" The doctor looked around the garden once more before answering, "Not today. I only wished to see how it was doing." Emma looked puzzled. "The garden?" He nodded. "Yes. Eleanor always believed a garden should be visited, even when one needed nothing from it." They continued walking together until they reached the calendula bed. Bright orange blossoms nodded gently in the cool breeze. The doctor knelt with surprising ease, despite his age. He carefully lifted one leaf between his fingers. Healthy. He smiled, almost to himself. Eleanor always managed to grow the strongest calendula in the parish. Emma crouched beside him. "I've noticed your name beside these flowers, and beside the comfrey." The doctor nodded. "I imagine you have." For a moment, he simply watched a bee making one final journey across the autumn flowers. Then he began. "When I first came to Willow Lane, nearly 30 years ago, I carried very little with me. My instruments, my books, a horse, and far more confidence than experience." Emma smiled. "I suspect many young doctors begin that way." "They do." He laughed quietly. And Eleanor understood that. He looked toward the comfrey leaves, swaying gently nearby. One afternoon, she arrived at my surgery, carrying 2 baskets, one filled with calendula, the other with comfrey. I thanked her. I assumed she meant them as a gift. He paused. She corrected me. The doctor's eyes brightened with the memory. "They're not for you," she said. "They're for whoever walks through your door tomorrow." Emma remained silent. The sentence felt entirely like Eleanor. "I told her medicine came from bottles." She smiled. "Sometimes," she answered. "But comfort grows in gardens." The doctor gently touched one orange blossom. "From that day onward, whenever I treated a child with scraped knees, or a farmer with blistered hands, or an old woman whose skin had cracked during winter, I came here first, for calendula, for comfrey." Emma looked across the flower beds. "So these weren't your flowers?" "No, they were never mine. They were never Eleanor's either." The doctor stood slowly. They belonged to whoever needed healing that week. A robin landed upon the old stone wall. Somewhere beyond the orchard, a cart rolled quietly along the lane. The village carried on with its ordinary morning. "I visited Eleanor only 3 days before she died," the doctor said softly. "We didn't speak much. She was tired. But before I left," he smiled. "She asked only one question." He looked toward the open gate. "Has anyone locked it yet?" I told her no. "Good," she said. "Then people will still know where to come." The doctor placed his hat back upon his head. "I've often thought she wasn't speaking about the garden." Emma followed his gaze. The gate stood exactly as it always had, open, unclaimed, patient. After the doctor had gone, Emma remained beside the calendula for a long while. She looked across every corner of the garden: the rosemary, the chamomile, the thyme, the mint, the lavender, the apple trees, the bees, the open gate. Then, almost without realizing it, she opened the garden book once more. This time she no longer saw lists. She saw people: Sarah, Margaret, Thomas, Dr. Merriweather, Alice, children she had never met, families she barely remembered, neighbors who had quietly walked through the same gate for decades. The garden had never been a place where people came to take. It had always been a place where Eleanor had quietly arranged for everyone to receive exactly what they needed. And without noticing when it had happened, Emma found that the question she had carried home from London had disappeared. She was no longer asking why the gate had never been locked. She was beginning to wonder how anyone could ever think of closing it. By the middle of October, the garden had begun preparing quietly for winter. The bright abundance of late summer had softened into gentler colors. Lavender had already been gathered and hung beneath the porch to dry. The apple trees carried fewer fruits each morning, and the herb beds, though still fragrant, no longer reached eagerly toward the sun. Instead, everything seemed content to slow down. Emma had fallen into the same rhythm. Each morning, she found another small task waiting for her. Sometimes it was no more than sweeping fallen leaves from the gravel path. Sometimes it meant tying the last climbing roses before the autumn winds grew stronger. Other mornings she simply walked. She had begun to believe that gardens revealed themselves best to people who walked without purpose. On one particularly still morning, after a night of light rain, Emma decided to tidy the far end of the orchard. It was a corner she had visited only once since returning to Willow Lane. As a child, she had rarely wandered that far. Her grandmother had always smiled whenever Emma reached the old apple trees. "If you keep walking," Eleanor would say, "you'll eventually find somewhere worth sitting." Emma had never asked what she meant. The grass was damp beneath her boots. Yellow leaves drifted lazily from the branches above, settling soundlessly upon the earth before another gentle breeze lifted them again. Beyond the orchard, the meadow stretched quietly toward the distant hills, where a thin veil of morning mist still lingered among the hedgerows. She carried only a rake. There were no flower beds here, no herbs, only old trees whose branches had watched generations come and go. Emma worked slowly. She gathered fallen leaves into neat little piles beneath the hedge, leaving enough scattered beneath the trees to protect the soil through the coming winter, exactly as Eleanor had once taught her. The work was peaceful, almost unnoticed, until the rake struck stone. The sound was soft, not sharp enough to startle her, only different. Emma stopped. She knelt and brushed away the leaves with her gloved hands. Little by little, pale grey stone emerged beneath the blanket of autumn leaves. First one corner, then another. Finally, the shape became clear. A bench. It had been carved from a single block of weathered limestone. Its edges had softened with age, yet the surface remained remarkably smooth. No cracks, no broken corners, only tiny patches of pale green lichen growing along the back, where rain seldom reached. Emma smiled. She could not remember ever seeing it before. Perhaps it had always been hidden by summer grass. Perhaps she had simply never looked. She cleared the remaining leaves from around its legs. The ground beneath was surprisingly clean. There were no weeds, no tangled brambles, not even the thick layer of moss she expected to find beneath something that had stood outdoors for so many years. Someone had been tending it. Recently, she stepped back. The bench stood beneath the oldest apple tree in the garden. From there one could see almost everything. The herb beds, the cottage roof, the greenhouse, the winding gravel paths, even the little wooden gate at the edge of the meadow. It was, Emma thought, perhaps the loveliest place in the entire garden. She brushed a few remaining leaves from the seat with the sleeve of her coat, then paused. There were no bird droppings, no stains left by fallen apples, no thick moss growing where rainwater gathered. It looked used, not worn, simply cared for. Emma reached out and rested her fingertips lightly upon the cool stone. It still held a little warmth from the morning sun. She glanced toward the cottage. No one was there. The garden lay perfectly still. Almost without thinking, she was about to sit. Something stopped her. She could not have explained why. There was no sign, no rule, no voice reminding her, only the quiet feeling that she had interrupted something she did not yet understand. Instead, she remained standing. A single breeze wandered through the orchard. One golden apple loosened from its branch and landed gently in the grass beside the bench. Emma picked it up. It was perfectly ripe. She placed it upon the stone seat, without really knowing why. The apple looked strangely at home there, as though it were not the first. She smiled at the thought and returned to her work. That afternoon, while watering the lavender, she glanced toward the orchard once or twice. The bench remained exactly where it had always been, quiet, patient, almost invisible among the trees. Yet from that day onward, Emma found herself thinking about it more often than she expected. Not because it was beautiful, although it was. Not because it was old. The whole garden was old. But because, in a place where every path, every herb bed, every tree had gradually revealed its purpose, the stone bench remained the only thing that seemed to ask a question without offering the smallest hint of an answer. The question followed Emma through the rest of the week. Not loudly. The stone bench never demanded her attention. It simply waited. Like the old apple tree above it, it seemed perfectly content to remain where it had always been, saying nothing at all. Yet every morning, while trimming roses or carrying water from the old well, Emma found her eyes drifting almost unconsciously toward the far end of the orchard. The bench was always there, quiet, unmoving, and somehow never forgotten. At first she thought she had imagined how carefully it had been kept. Perhaps she had simply found it on a fortunate morning. Perhaps the wind had spared that corner. Perhaps the fallen leaves had gathered elsewhere. But the next day, when she walked to the orchard after breakfast, the stone seat was once again perfectly clean. Fresh leaves surrounded it. None rested upon it. Emma looked upward. The branches above carried dozens of yellow apples and thinning leaves. Surely something should have fallen. Yet the stone remained almost spotless. She said nothing. Instead, she continued with her work. The following morning, she rose a little earlier than usual, before lighting the kitchen fire, before putting the kettle on. The village still slept beneath a pale October mist. Only the rooks had begun their conversations among the distant elms. Emma wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and quietly crossed the garden. She stopped behind the old pear tree, where she could see the orchard without easily being seen herself. She had not planned to hide, only to watch. The bench waited beneath the apple tree, exactly as before. Nothing happened for several minutes. The mist drifted slowly across the meadow. Somewhere beyond the hedgerow, a cowbell rang softly. Then, The wooden gate creaked. An elderly gentleman entered the garden. Emma recognized him, only vaguely. She believed he lived in one of the cottages beyond the church. He carried no basket, no tools, no flowers. He walked slowly along the familiar path without once looking toward the cottage. When he reached the bench, he stopped. From the pocket of his coat, he removed a single red apple. He placed it carefully upon the stone seat. He rested one hand lightly against the back of the bench, not sitting, not speaking, simply standing there. After perhaps half a minute, he nodded once, almost imperceptibly. Then he turned and quietly left the garden. Emma remained perfectly still. She waited until the gate closed softly behind him. Only then did she step from behind the pear tree. The apple lay exactly where he had placed it, bright against the pale grey stone. She reached out, then stopped. For reasons she could not explain, touching it suddenly felt as inappropriate as opening someone else's letter. She left it where it was. The next morning brought another visitor. This time it was a young woman carrying a small bunch of late autumn asters. She walked directly to the bench, laid the flowers gently upon the stone, smoothed one fallen leaf away with the back of her hand, and left. Again, she never sat down. On Thursday, it was a little girl, no older than 7. She arrived holding a single feather she had probably found somewhere in the meadow. She looked around shyly, placed the feather beside the apple, smiled to herself, then skipped back toward the village. Friday brought no one. Saturday, an old farmer paused only long enough to leave 2 acorns. Sunday afternoon, after church, a widow, carrying a small sprig of lavender, stood silently beside the bench, while the church bells echoed across the valley. She remained there for several minutes. Her gloved hand rested gently upon the cool stone. She never sat. Emma noticed the same pattern every time. Nobody hurried. Nobody lingered too long. Nobody looked toward the cottage. Everyone approached the bench with the quiet familiarity of someone visiting a place whose purpose required no explanation. Each left something small, a flower, a leaf, an apple, a feather, an acorn, then walked away. The objects themselves seemed almost unimportant. It was the care with which they were placed that puzzled Emma. Each one rested neatly upon the center of the bench, never tossed, never forgotten, as though every offering completed a conversation she could not hear. By the 7th morning, Emma no longer believed these visits were coincidences. She fetched the garden book from the kitchen and began turning its pages once more. Weather, plants, names, nothing about the bench, nothing about the orchard, nothing at all. She searched again, carefully, page after page. Years passed beneath her fingertips. Still nothing. At last she closed the book. For the first time since arriving in Willow Lane, the garden book had failed to answer a question. Emma looked once more toward the orchard. The stone bench stood beneath the old apple tree, washed gently by the pale light of another autumn afternoon. Upon it rested a single yellow leaf that must have fallen only moments before. No sooner had it landed than a familiar breeze lifted it quietly away. The bench was empty once again, waiting, patiently, as though it knew that, sooner or later, someone would come, carrying another small piece of their heart. The morning rain had long since passed, leaving the orchard washed clean beneath a pale October sky. The clouds drifted lazily above the hills, and the last bees of the season wandered slowly among the remaining asters, as though reluctant to admit that autumn was nearing its end. Emma had spent most of the day gathering fallen apples. Some would become pies. Others would be stored carefully in the cool pantry beneath the stairs. The bruised fruit she carried to the compost heap, just as Eleanor had always done. Nothing in the garden was ever wasted. By late afternoon, the sunlight had turned soft and golden. Emma found herself walking once more toward the orchard. She no longer pretended it was an accident. She had come to look at the bench. It stood exactly as before, beneath the old apple tree, empty, quiet, patient. The apple the elderly gentleman had left several days earlier was gone. So were the flowers, the feather, the acorns. Someone had removed them. Not carelessly, simply at the proper time. Emma heard footsteps upon the gravel. She turned. Mrs. Bell was approaching with a small basket over one arm. Inside lay several jars of blackberry preserve, wrapped neatly in linen. "I thought you might like these before winter," she said warmly. Emma thanked her. Together, they began walking slowly toward the cottage. But when they reached the orchard, Emma stopped. She looked toward the bench, then back at Mrs. Bell. "I've watched it every day." Mrs. Bell followed her gaze. The older woman smiled very gently. "I thought you might." Emma hesitated. "For a whole week. People keep coming. They leave flowers, apples, leaves. They stand there. They never sit." Mrs. Bell remained silent. Emma continued. "I looked through the garden book. There isn't a single word about it. No page, no drawing, no note." She looked almost apologetic. "I don't understand." For a long while, neither woman spoke. A breeze wandered through the apple branches above them, carrying one yellow leaf gently onto the grass between their feet. Mrs. Bell bent to pick it up. Instead of dropping it, she carried it quietly to the bench. She laid it beside the weathered stone. Only then did she turn back. It wasn't always called the bench. Emma waited. "Years ago," Mrs. Bell said softly, "it was simply the place beneath the apple tree." She rested one hand upon the smooth stone. It was Eleanor's favorite corner, not because it was beautiful, though it certainly was. She said it was the quietest place in the whole garden. Emma looked around. The orchard really was quieter than anywhere else. The cottage seemed farther away. The church bell reached the trees only as a distant echo. Even the breeze moved more softly here. Mrs. Bell continued. "One winter, there was a young mother in the village. Her little boy became ill." She paused. "The doctor did everything he could. So did everyone else. But some sorrows cannot be persuaded to leave." Emma lowered her eyes. "The little boy died just after Christmas." For a while, only the wind answered. Mrs. Bell spoke more quietly now. "The following week, the mother came to see Eleanor. She said she didn't know what to do. She couldn't stay inside the house, but she couldn't bear to speak to anyone either." Mrs. Bell looked toward the bench. "Eleanor didn't offer advice. She didn't quote scripture. She didn't tell her that time would heal anything." Emma could almost hear her grandmother's voice. "What did she say?" Mrs. Bell smiled sadly. "Only this." She repeated the words exactly as she had heard them many years before. "If you need silence, the bench will be waiting." Nothing more. "No explanation?" Emma asked. Mrs. Bell shook her head. "None. The young mother came here the next morning, and the morning after that, and many mornings after. Sometimes she sat, sometimes she only stood, sometimes she cried, sometimes she watched the birds. Eleanor never disturbed her. The orchard had grown almost completely still. Only a single robin hopped beneath the hedge, searching for insects among the fallen leaves. After a while, Mrs. Bell continued, other people began coming. A widower, a father, a sister, a child. No one announced why. No one asked. They simply knew. She smiled faintly. Word travels differently in villages. Emma looked again at the smooth stone. So that's why no one sits. Mrs. Bell nodded. Not anymore. The bench was never meant for resting. It became something else. She rested her fingertips lightly against the weathered limestone. It reminds people that grief doesn't always need conversation. Sometimes, she looked toward the open meadow beyond the gate. It only needs somewhere gentle enough to be carried for a little while. Emma stood quietly beside her. For the first time since returning to Willow Lane, she understood why the stone had always been so carefully cleaned, why every flower had been placed so gently, why every visitor had remained standing in silence. The bench had never been a memorial. It had never belonged to one family. It had quietly become a promise, a place where no one needed permission to bring their sorrow. No one needed to explain why they had come, and no one was expected to leave feeling any lighter than when they arrived. Sometimes, Eleanor had believed being welcomed was healing enough. Emma looked once more toward the old apple tree. The bench no longer seemed mysterious. It seemed kind, and somehow that was even more difficult to forget. Life in the cottage gradually settled into quieter days. By the final week of October, the mornings arrived later, and the evenings seemed to gather around the little house long before supper. Smoke curled gently from the chimneys of Willow Lane, and every afternoon the distant church bell carried farther across the bare fields than it had only a few weeks before. Emma had stopped counting the days since she arrived. The garden now measured time for her. There was always another task waiting, another season quietly preparing to become the next. One cool morning, she carried the garden book beneath her arm and walked slowly through every flower bed, making notes exactly as Eleanor once had. Which herbs had finished flowering, which roses needed cutting back, which perennials should be divided before winter. She was no longer copying Eleanor. She was beginning to understand her. The notebook rested open in one hand. The garden spread before her in comfortable silence. She worked from one end to the other, the lavender beds, the rosemary hedge, the thyme by the gate, the calendula beside the stone path. Each corner had its purpose. Each plant belonged somewhere. When she reached the far western edge of the garden, beyond the orchard and not far from the stone bench, she noticed something she had somehow overlooked until now. A single rectangular flower bed, neatly bordered with old bricks. The soil had been turned recently enough that weeds had found little chance to settle there. Yet nothing grew, not a rose, not an herb, not even winter cabbage, only dark, well-kept earth. Emma frowned slightly. It seemed strangely out of place. Every other corner of the garden overflowed with quiet usefulness. Only this small bed remained empty. She knelt beside it. The soil was soft beneath her fingers, rich, healthy. Someone had clearly cared for it throughout the year. It had not been abandoned. It had been prepared for nothing, or so it seemed. Emma opened the garden book. She turned to the autumn pages. Nothing. She searched the spring entries. Still nothing. Summer, winter, year after year. At last, almost hidden near the bottom of one page, written nearly 15 years earlier, she found a single line. No weather, no plant, no name, only 2 words. Leave open. Emma read them again, then a third time. There was no explanation, no drawing beside the entry, no note written later in the margin. Only those 2 simple words. Leave open. She looked from the page back to the empty bed. The phrase did not sound accidental. It sounded intentional. She turned more pages. The same words appeared again. Every autumn, every spring, sometimes in Eleanor's older handwriting, sometimes in later years, when her writing had grown a little slower. Always identical. Leave open. Emma closed the book and rested it upon her lap. She tried to imagine Eleanor standing exactly where she now knelt. Surely there had been moments when another row of roses would have looked beautiful here, or more lavender, or vegetables for the winter kitchen. The space was large enough for almost anything. Yet year after year, Eleanor had chosen to plant nothing at all. A breeze crossed the meadow. Dry leaves rolled gently over the empty soil. before continuing toward the orchard. Emma reached down and picked away one tiny weed that had managed to appear near the border. It was the only plant growing there. She smiled to herself. Without thinking, she pulled a few more, then smoothed the soil flat again with the back of her gardening glove. Only when she had finished did she realize what she had done. She had cared for the empty bed exactly as carefully as every bed filled with flowers. She laughed quietly. It seems I'm looking after something that doesn't even exist. The words disappeared into the cool afternoon air. No one answered. The old apple tree swayed gently behind her. Beyond it, the stone bench rested peacefully beneath its branches. The open gate stood in the distance, just visible between the hedgerows. Everything in the garden seemed to have revealed its purpose at last. The rosemary carried the scent of Sunday bread. The chamomile remembered children's lessons. The thyme warmed winter evenings. The calendula and comfrey had quietly comforted the injured. Even the stone bench had become a place where silence itself was welcomed. Only this single patch of earth remained unexplained. Emma looked once more at the neat words in the garden book. Leave open, not empty, not forgotten, open. There was a difference. She could feel it. She simply did not yet understand what it meant. Life in the cottage gradually settled into quieter days. By the final week of October, the mornings arrived later, and the evenings seemed to gather around the little house long before supper. Smoke curled gently from the chimneys of Willow Lane, and every afternoon the distant church bell carried farther across the bare fields than it had only a few weeks before. Emma had stopped counting the days since she arrived. The garden now measured time for her. There was always another task waiting, another season quietly preparing to become the next. One cool morning, she carried the garden book beneath her arm and walked slowly through every flower bed, making notes exactly as Eleanor once had. Which herbs had finished flowering, which roses needed cutting back, which perennials should be divided before winter. She was no longer copying Eleanor. She was beginning to understand her. The notebook rested open in one hand. The garden spread before her in comfortable silence. She worked from one end to the other. The lavender beds, the rosemary hedge, the thyme by the gate, the calendula beside the stone path. Each corner had its purpose. Each plant belonged somewhere. When she reached the far western edge of the garden, beyond the orchard and not far from the stone bench, she noticed something she had somehow overlooked until now. A single rectangular flower bed, neatly bordered with old bricks. The soil had been turned recently enough that weeds had found little chance to settle there. Yet nothing grew. Not a rose, not an herb, not even winter cabbage. Only dark, well-kept earth. Emma frowned slightly. It seemed strangely out of place. Every other corner of the garden overflowed with quiet usefulness. Only this small bed remained empty. She knelt beside it. The soil was soft beneath her fingers, rich, healthy. Someone had clearly cared for it throughout the year. It had not been abandoned. It had been prepared for nothing. Or so it seemed. Emma opened the garden book. She turned to the autumn pages. Nothing. She searched the spring entries. Still nothing. Summer, winter, year after year. At last, almost hidden near the bottom of one page written nearly 15 years earlier, she found a single line. No weather, no plant, no name, only 2 words. Leave open. Emma read them again, then a third time. There was no explanation, no drawing beside the entry, no note written later in the margin. Only those 2 simple words. Leave open. She looked from the page back to the empty bed. The phrase did not sound accidental. It sounded intentional. She turned more pages. The same words appeared again. Every autumn, every spring, sometimes in Eleanor's older handwriting, sometimes in later years when her writing had grown a little slower, always identical. Leave open. Emma closed the book and rested it upon her lap. She tried to imagine Eleanor standing exactly where she now knelt. Surely, there had been moments when another row of roses would have looked beautiful here, or more lavender, or vegetables for the winter kitchen. The space was large enough for almost anything, yet year after year, Eleanor had chosen to plant nothing at all. A breeze crossed the meadow. Dry leaves rolled gently over the empty soil before continuing toward the orchard. Emma reached down and picked away one tiny weed that had managed to appear near the border. It was the only plant growing there. She smiled to herself. Without thinking, she pulled a few more, then smoothed the soil flat again with the back of her gardening glove. Only when she had finished did she realize what she had done. She had cared for the empty bed exactly as carefully as every bed filled with flowers. She laughed quietly. It seems I'm looking after something that doesn't even exist. The words disappeared into the cool afternoon air. No one answered. The old apple tree swayed gently behind her. Beyond it, the stone bench rested peacefully beneath its branches. The open gate stood in the distance, just visible between the hedgerows. Everything in the garden seemed to have revealed its purpose at last. The rosemary carried the scent of Sunday bread. The chamomile remembered children's lessons. The thyme warmed winter evenings. The calendula and comfrey had quietly comforted the injured. Even the stone bench had become a place where silence itself was welcomed. Only this single patch of earth remained unexplained. Emma looked once more at the neat words in the garden book. Leave open, not empty, not forgotten, open. There was a difference. She could feel it. She simply did not yet understand what it meant. The words stayed with Emma for several days. Leave open. She repeated them silently while sweeping the kitchen floor, while hanging freshly washed linen in the autumn sunshine, while carrying firewood into the cottage before the evening chill settled over Willow Lane. The words followed her quietly, asking for nothing, yet refusing to leave. If the empty flower bed had been prepared every year, then surely something had once belonged there, or perhaps something still did. One cold morning, while a fine white frost silvered the herb beds for the first time that season, Emma carried the garden book into the potting shed. It was a small building tucked behind the greenhouse, its windows clouded with age, and the scent of dried herbs lingering pleasantly among old shelves and earthenware pots. This had been Eleanor's workshop. Everything remained exactly where she had left it. Bundles of twine hung from wooden pegs. Clay pots stood neatly stacked beneath the workbench. Old seed envelopes rested inside shallow drawers, each labeled in Eleanor's careful handwriting. Foxglove, sweet pea, hollyhock, calendula, rosemary, lavender. Emma opened each drawer slowly. The packets inside were arranged with astonishing care. Some were decades old. Others had clearly been gathered only the previous summer. Every seed had its place. Every envelope carried a date, sometimes a brief note, best near the south wall, save for early spring. The bees prefer these. The little room felt less like a shed than a library, except that instead of books, Eleanor had collected seasons. Emma searched the shelves one by one. She was not entirely certain what she expected to find. Perhaps an unfinished note, perhaps another page of the garden book, perhaps simply another clue. Outside, the wind rattled softly against the greenhouse glass. Somewhere a robin landed upon the roof, its tiny footsteps making the faintest tapping sound overhead. At last, near the very back of the highest shelf, almost hidden behind several empty clay pots, Emma noticed a small wooden box. It was hardly larger than a loaf of bread, made of polished oak. Its brass hinges had darkened with age. Unlike everything else in the shed, It carried no label. Emma lifted it carefully onto the workbench. A fine layer of dust rested upon the lid, not thick enough to suggest years of neglect, only enough to suggest that Eleanor had expected someone else to open it. She hesitated, then slowly lifted the lid. Inside were dozens of tiny paper envelopes, every one completely blank. No flower names, no planting instructions, no dates, only neatly folded packets waiting in perfect silence. Emma picked up the first one. It felt surprisingly light. Seeds, tiny ones, but of what variety she could not tell. The second envelope was the same. So was the third. Not one carried a single word. She frowned. Her grandmother had labeled everything. Every herb, every cutting, every bundle of twine. Why not these? At the very bottom of the box lay one final envelope, folded differently from the others. Emma unfolded it with great care. There were no seeds inside, only a small piece of cream-colored paper. The handwriting was immediately familiar, steady, elegant, unmistakably Eleanor's. It contained only one sentence. "For the gardener after me." Nothing more. Emma read it again. The little shed became perfectly still. Even the robin upon the roof seemed to have flown away. She looked back into the box. Blank envelopes, unknown seeds, no instructions, no names, no explanation. Emma smiled to herself. At last, she thought, she had found it. The special flower. Some forgotten variety that Eleanor had saved for the future. Perhaps something too rare to grow every year. Perhaps a flower that bloomed only once in a generation. Perhaps that was why the bed had remained empty. She carefully folded the note and returned it to the box, exactly as she had found it. Then she closed the lid. For a long moment, she rested both hands upon the smooth oak, the empty flower bed, the mysterious seeds, the words, "For the gardener after me." Everything seemed, at last, to fit together. Or so Emma believed. Outside, a cold breeze wandered through the orchard. The open gate creaked gently on its hinges before falling silent once again. The garden, however, kept its final answer to itself. Just a little longer. Emma waited 2 days before showing anyone the wooden box. Not because she wished to keep it secret, but because she wanted to be certain of what she believed. Each evening, she placed the box upon the kitchen table after supper. Each morning, she opened it again. The blank envelopes, the unknown seeds, the small folded note, always the same, always waiting. Outside, October slowly surrendered to November. The last roses had faded. Only the rosemary remained vividly green against the cooling earth, while the apple trees stood almost bare beneath pale grey skies. The empty flower bed rested quietly beyond the orchard, prepared, waiting. Emma looked at it every morning, and every morning she became a little more convinced. Surely, Eleanor had intended something extraordinary. Why else would she leave a bed untouched for so many years? Why else preserve a box of unnamed seeds? On Friday afternoon, Mrs. Bell arrived carrying a basket of freshly baked oatcakes wrapped in linen. The two women shared tea beside the kitchen fire, while rain tapped gently against the cottage windows. Only after the cups had grown half empty did Emma disappear into the pantry. She returned carrying the little oak box with both hands. Mrs. Bell recognized it immediately. "Oh," she said quietly. "You found it?" Emma nodded. "I think I finally understood." Mrs. Bell looked interested. "Have you?" Emma smiled. "I believe Grandmother was saving something very special." She opened the lid. The empty flower bed, the unnamed seeds, the note. She unfolded the little piece of paper. "For the gardener after me." Emma looked up. "I think she wanted the next gardener to grow these. Perhaps a rare flower, something too precious to plant every year." Mrs. Bell listened patiently. She said nothing until Emma had finished. Then, quite unexpectedly, she laughed. Not loudly, not mockingly, only the soft laugh of someone remembering an old friend who had once done something wonderfully familiar. Emma blinked. Have I misunderstood? Mrs. Bell reached gently into the box. She lifted one blank envelope, turned it over, smiled again. Oh, Eleanor. She shook her head affectionately. She would have enjoyed hearing your theory. Emma looked puzzled. So, they aren't rare seeds? Mrs. Bell looked genuinely surprised. My dear, Eleanor never cared in the slightest whether a flower was rare. She set the envelope back into the box. If a flower pleased the bees, if children smiled when it bloomed, if neighbors liked taking it home, that was rarity enough for her. Emma remained silent. Mrs. Bell continued. Do you know why the envelopes are blank? Emma slowly shook her head. Because they were never meant to stay in this box. The room became very quiet. Rain whispered softly against the old cottage windows. Mrs. Bell looked toward the garden beyond the glass. Eleanor used to collect seeds every autumn, not for herself, for whoever came after. Every spring she filled new envelopes, but she never wrote the names. Emma frowned gently. Why not? Mrs. Bell smiled. Because she didn't want the next gardener to grow her favorite flowers. She wanted them to grow their own. Emma looked again at the folded note. Suddenly the words seemed different. Not instructions. Permission. Mrs. Bell continued. That empty bed, she paused, was never waiting for Eleanor's final flower. It was waiting for someone else's first one. Emma felt something inside her grow unexpectedly still. All those weeks, she had imagined a mystery, a forgotten species, a secret inherited across generations. Yet the truth was astonishingly simple. The bed had remained empty because Eleanor believed every gardener deserved one corner of the garden that belonged entirely to them. One place untouched by the past. One place where they would not feel obliged to imitate anyone. Mrs. Bell looked toward Emma with warm, thoughtful eyes. You've spent all these weeks learning Eleanor's garden, learning her habits, her roses, her herbs, her seasons. She smiled. But she never expected you to become Eleanor. Only then did Emma understand why the note had not said, plant these, or continue my garden. It had simply said, for the gardener after me. Not for the granddaughter, not for the heir, not even for Emma, for the gardener, whoever that person might become. Mrs. Bell reached across the table and gently closed the lid of the little oak box. Eleanor trusted you with the easiest part. She smiled. The difficult part. She glanced toward the empty flower bed, beyond the rain-covered window, is deciding what you love enough to plant. Emma looked through the glass, toward the waiting patch of dark earth. For the first time, she no longer saw an empty space. She saw a beginning, and suddenly she understood why the garden book had never called it empty. It had always used another word, leave open, because some places are not left vacant through neglect. They are left open for someone else's future to bloom. November gave way quietly to winter. The last leaves drifted from the orchard one by one until the branches stood bare against a pale grey sky. Frost settled across the herb beds almost every morning now, turning each rosemary leaf and lavender stem into delicate silver before the rising sun slowly melted them away. The garden had become quieter, not empty, simply resting. Emma discovered that winter asked different things of a gardener. There were fewer flowers to tend, fewer weeds to pull. Instead, there were paths to sweep after every storm, fruit trees to prune while they slept, bird feeders to refill before dawn, and logs to stack neatly beside the kitchen door before another snowfall arrived. The work was slower, but no less meaningful. Some mornings, no one came through the gate. Other mornings, a familiar neighbor appeared, only long enough to cut a little rosemary or exchange a few quiet words before continuing on toward the village. Nothing seemed hurried. Winter encouraged everyone to move more gently. One cold afternoon, as sleet tapped softly against the cottage windows, a carpenter from the neighboring village arrived exactly as Emma had requested several weeks before. His cart carried fresh oak boards, new hinges, and a small iron latch wrapped carefully inside a piece of canvas. Emma greeted him at the gate. He removed his cap politely. "I've brought everything," she nodded. Together they walked slowly toward the old wooden gate. The carpenter examined its weathered posts. "It has served well." "It has," Emma replied. He measured the opening, ran one hand across the timber. "The new latch will fit nicely. We could have it locked before nightfall." Emma looked at the gate. Beyond it stretched the familiar lane leading into Willow Lane. She imagined Sarah arriving on Sunday morning, Thomas crossing the meadow before sunrise, Miss Ellis leading children through the orchard in spring, Dr. Merriweather pausing beside the calendula. She imagined the young mother Mrs. Bell had spoken about, walking quietly toward the bench beneath the apple tree. Then she imagined all of them finding the gate closed. The thought settled heavily in her chest. The carpenter waited patiently. He mistook her silence for uncertainty. "If you'd rather think on it." Emma looked once more at the old latch, hanging loosely from the weathered wood. It had never truly kept anyone out. Perhaps it had never been meant to. She smiled gently. "I'm sorry. I've changed my mind." The carpenter blinked. "No lock." Emma shook her head. "No lock." He looked mildly surprised. "But the gate will remain open." Emma smiled. "I think." She rested one hand upon the old timber. "It was always meant to." The carpenter simply nodded. He packed away the unused latch without another question. Before leaving, he tightened the loose hinges, replaced one worn plank near the bottom of the gate, and straightened the old post so it swung more easily than before. When he finished, the gate looked almost exactly as it always had, only stronger. Emma thanked him. As his cart disappeared along the snowy lane, she stood, watching the gate move gently in the winter wind. It opened, closed halfway, opened again, never completely shutting. Winter passed slowly. Christmas came and went, with quiet church bells, candlelight, and evenings spent beside the fire, reading Eleanor's old gardening books. Then, almost unnoticed, February softened into March. The first snowdrops appeared beneath the orchard hedge. Soon after came crocuses pushing bravely through the cold earth. The garden had begun speaking again. One clear morning, beneath a sky washed clean by spring rain, Emma carried the little oak seed box into the garden. She walked slowly toward the empty flower bed. The soil waited exactly as Eleanor had left it. Rich, dark, patient. Emma knelt upon the cool earth. She opened the box. Inside, the blank envelopes rested exactly where she had placed them months before. She smiled, then quietly set the box aside. Instead of choosing one of the unnamed packets, she reached into the pocket of her gardening apron. There she carried a small paper envelope she had bought herself during the first market day of spring. Across the front, she had written only 2 words, "Sweet peas." They had always been her favorite, not because they were rare, not because they were fashionable, simply because, as a little girl, she had loved their fragrance, drifting through open windows on warm June evenings. Mrs. Bell had been right. Eleanor had never wanted another Eleanor. She had hoped for another gardener. Emma scattered the seeds gently across the waiting bed, covered them with fine soil, pressed the earth lightly with both hands, then poured the first watering can of spring across the dark ground. The water disappeared almost immediately. Nothing changed. No flowers bloomed. No miracle announced itself, only quiet earth receiving new life. Emma remained kneeling for another moment. The breeze carried the scent of damp soil through the orchard. Somewhere nearby, the first bee of the season wandered lazily among the snowdrops. The garden was no longer exactly Eleanor's, and that, Emma realized with a peaceful smile, was precisely what Eleanor had hoped for all along. Spring arrived quietly, as it always seemed to do in Yorkshire. There was no single morning when winter simply disappeared. Instead, the garden changed a little each day. The rosemary carried brighter shoots. The apple trees unfolded pale green leaves, no larger than a child's thumbnail. The lavender slowly colored again after its long winter sleep. And in the little flower bed beyond the orchard, the first delicate shoots of Emma's sweet peas finally emerged through the dark earth. She smiled when she saw them, not because they were remarkable. They were only tiny green stems, fragile, ordinary, almost invisible, unless someone stopped to look carefully. Eleanor would have approved. The weeks passed peacefully. The village settled into the familiar rhythm of another growing season. Sarah continued baking her Sunday bread. The children returned with Miss Ellis to press spring flowers between the pages of old books. Thomas still crossed the meadow before breakfast whenever he needed time. Dr. Merriweather still paused now and then to admire the calendula before continuing along the village road. The garden remained exactly what it had always been, alive. One mild April morning, Emma was kneeling beside the sweet peas, gently tying their first climbing shoots to slender willow canes. A blackbird sang somewhere beyond the orchard. Bees drifted lazily among the blossom of the apple trees. The cottage windows stood open for the first time that year, allowing the scent of fresh bread from the village bakery to wander softly into the garden. It was the sort of morning Eleanor would have called perfectly ordinary. Emma heard the gate creak. Without looking up, she assumed another familiar neighbor had arrived. Perhaps Sarah, perhaps Thomas. Instead, the footsteps stopped, not upon the garden path, only just inside the gate. Emma lifted her head. A little girl stood there, perhaps 7 years old. She wore a faded blue coat that had clearly belonged to an older sister, and both hands clutched a small basket far too tightly. She looked toward the herb beds, then toward the cottage, then back at the gate again, as though uncertain whether she ought to have entered at all. Emma smiled gently. "Good morning." The little girl started. "I'm sorry. I wasn't going to take anything." Her voice was almost a whisper. "My mother said," she hesitated. "People used to come here." Emma rested her gardening gloves upon the ground. "They still do." The little girl looked relieved, though she remained where she was. "We've only just moved into the village. I don't really know anyone." Emma stood slowly. She brushed the soil from her skirt before walking toward the gate. Not hurriedly, not cautiously, simply with the calm certainty that had gradually become part of her over the past months. She stopped beside the child. The old wooden gate stood open between them, exactly as it always had. Emma rested one hand upon its weathered timber. Then she smiled, the same quiet smile the village had remembered on Eleanor's face for so many years. "Come in." Only 2 words, nothing more. The little girl looked into the garden, at the rosemary, the lavender, the apple trees, the winding paths, the bees already busy among the blossoms. Slowly, she stepped across the threshold. Emma watched her wander toward the herb beds, curiosity replacing hesitation with every step. For a brief moment, the years seemed to fold gently together. She could almost imagine another spring, another gardener, another little girl crossing the same gate long ago. Not much had changed, only the hands that welcomed people. Emma turned toward the empty path leading back to the cottage. It was no longer truly Eleanor's garden. nor had it become only Emma's. The herbs still belonged to those who needed them. The bench still waited beneath the apple tree for anyone seeking silence. Children still discovered flowers here before they learned their names. Neighbors still entered without asking, and the gate remained open. Years later, visitors would sometimes ask who owned the little cottage at the end of Willow Lane. Some would say it belonged to Miss Ashcroft. Others would simply call it the house with the open gate. Neither answer was entirely correct, for the garden had never truly belonged to the woman who tended it. It belonged to every weary traveler who found a moment of rest beneath the apple trees, to every child who learned the names of flowers, to every neighbor who carried home a little rosemary or thyme, to every quiet heart that discovered, perhaps when it needed it most, that there was still one place in the village where no invitation was ever required. One warm June evening, as sweet peas climbed happily across the little trellis Emma had built with her own hands, she paused beside the gate before closing the garden for the night. She rested her hand upon the weathered wood. Then, just as Eleanor had done for so many years, she left it exactly where it was, half open, waiting, because some gardens are grown with seeds, and others are grown with welcome. And so, as another quiet evening settles over Willow Lane, the little cottage grows still once more. The sweet peas continue climbing their wooden trellis. The rosemary waits for Sunday's bread. The stone bench rests beneath the old apple tree, ready for anyone who may one day need a moment of silence. And the garden gate remains gently open. Perhaps that is how the kindest places in the world have always survived. Not by keeping people out, but by quietly letting them in. Thank you for spending this peaceful evening here with me. If you found comfort in Emma's story, I hope you'll return another night, when another forgotten cottage, another quiet village, or another gentle soul is waiting to be discovered. But for now, there is nowhere else you need to be. Nothing left to finish, nothing waiting for you except rest. May your dreams be gentle, may your night be peaceful, and may you always find a place where the gate is left open for you. Good night.